Fighting games have always been a popular genre, even since the early beginnings of video games. A simple concept innately understood inside all of us. 1v1 combat to see who's the better fighter. In arcades and on home consoles, fighting games were incredibly popular. However, as the genre was still new, many of the standard mechanics and features of fighting games had yet to be established. It wasn't until Capcom's incredibly popular Street Fighter II came out and defined the standards of what a fighting game should be. After that, everyone followed the formula and applied their own gimmicks in order to stand out. Some would use gore, weapons, tag teams, and others would expand into 3D. However, nothing would truly challenge the fighting game format until one developer took a risk and created a game that's gone on to become a phenomenon. In late 1997, Masahiro Sakurai was working at HAL Laboratories. At the young age of 27, the young designer had already begun making a name for himself by creating the Kirby series. An action platformer that was praised for its unique gameplay and accessibility. In Kirby, not only could you move left, right, and jump, as in most standard 2D platformers, but you could also fly across levels indefinitely. However, while flying, Kirby's only defense is to release the air puff held in his mouth, which cancels out his flight. Kirby can also suck up enemies and objects, which the player can then either spit out as a projectile or swallow. In the second game in the series, Kirby's Adventure, it introduced the mechanic of copying by swallowing enemies. Kirby would then gain a new ability replacing the suck move. Despite the clear success of Kirby, Sakurai was happy to hand over the reins to HAL, after directing just 3 games in the Kirby franchise. As of today, Kirby has continued to remain popular, and the series has become a cornerstone franchise for Nintendo, seeing 23 releases in the series and selling a combined total of 38 million units. After seeing how Sakurai had succeeded in creating such a unique and refreshing take on the platformer, it was clear he wasn't afraid to experiment with new mechanics and ideas in order to challenge typical genre and game conventions. So Sakurai was then tasked by HAL Laboratories to create different game concepts for the then new Nintendo 64 that had been released 1 year prior. The first concept was an action-adventure game that Sakurai has stated never really went anywhere, however the second seemed to have some potential. The second concept was a fighting game which would be designed to appeal to a more casual audience that might be intimidated by traditional fighting games, as newcomers would not stand a chance against more experienced players who had mastered complex button inputs, combos, and mechanics that beginners may find overwhelming and act as a harsh barrier to entry. When you watch high-level matches of Marvel, you will often see players start a combo and keep it going until their opponent is KO'd. You can convert a single stray hit into a very long combo, and it's not rare to see a character start with full health and lose all of it from a single combo. Think about what it's like to be comboed like that. Is that fun? Doesn't that seem absurd and unreasonable? That's what I thought, but when you get down to it, it's not that complicated. It's still a contest of skill between 2 people. Sakurai approached the president of HAL, Satoru Iwata, with the concept of an accessible fighting game. Iwata quickly jumped on board, agreeing to help with the programming. Iwata was keen to work on a game that utilized the N64's analog stick and wanted to make a game that would support up to 4 players playing at the same time, but also because of his faith in Sakurai as a game designer. My decision to pursue the project in this way rested on one point and one point alone. Sakurai is capable of taking a project with nothing and visualizing a completed game almost perfectly in his head. The two began to work together on this concept, originally dubbing it
4 players simultaneous face-off, no damage, battle royale.
However, surprisingly, the name didn't stick. As time went on, the two managed to get a working prototype together called first Ryo, the fighting game, and then it was later renamed Dragon King, the fighter. Looking at this prototype, you can clearly see where the game was headed, and you can definitely see the origins of the game within this prototype. However, as this was an incredibly early proof of gameplay concept, there had yet to be any real character or aesthetic for the game. At the time, fighting games were incredibly popular, and because of this, the pair wanted to make sure that the game would have a distinct gameplay style and mechanics so that it could stand out in the genre that was reaching saturation. Especially as this was set to be a console exclusive, which at the time there hadn't been many incredibly successful home console exclusive fighting games. In a bid to distance itself from other fighters, the pair decided to add in Nintendo franchise characters. We were considering asking someone else to design all the characters, or to make all the characters dogs, the first dog fighting game. I also thought about using all the Kirby characters. Out of all those ideas, we eventually came to the conclusion that using Nintendo characters in a Battle Royale format would have the most punch. By using the already iconic Nintendo characters, the game could tap into the brand recognition that Nintendo already had, making it easier for the audience to get invested in the characters. The pair added instantly recognizable characters, Mario and Donkey Kong, Samus Aran from the Metroid series, and Fox McCloud from Star Fox into the prototype as playable characters. However, as great as this idea was, it was also quite a risk, as Sakurai and Iwata did not consult Nintendo about this. Nintendo are known to be incredibly protective of their established properties, and would be incredibly careful in considering allowing anyone to use their characters. Iwata in particular had his doubts about how Nintendo would receive this, after having a private conversation with Shigeru Miyamoto about the concept of using Nintendo characters. Miyamoto warned Iwata of the heavy responsibility of using such revered characters, and the logistical restrictions and requirements it could cause. Unsure about how this entire project would be received, Sakurai and Iwata presented their prototype to Nintendo. The pair were nervous, not knowing how Nintendo would react to seeing their beloved characters in a fighting game. However, Nintendo approved the demo and the game was put into full development. The project was greenlit even though they didn't really believe the game would be a massive success. It was mainly approved as a fighting game could be developed quickly and relatively easily by a team that were inexperienced with the Nintendo 64 hardware. Nintendo gave HAL a modest budget, so the game could be developed quickly and then exclusively sold in Japan, with no plans for an international release. But despite a small budget and projected limited success, Sakurai and his team were committed to making the best game they possibly could. It was our first Nintendo 64 game as well, so we definitely felt that we had to produce something of quality. And also because we were borrowing a lot of Nintendo characters, and each character had their own creator. I didn't want to portray the original creators and let them down. Sometimes my own creation Kirby is used in other places, and sometimes I think Kirby wouldn't move like that, and I want to avoid that if possible. Along with Nintendo's blessing came a new name for the game. At the time, Japanese markets didn't seem excited by the prospect of a Nintendo all-star fighting game. Sakurai felt this lack of interest would be due to the public misunderstanding the game, and writing Smash Bros. Off as a Nintendo-branded Street Fighter clone. Also, gaming magazines were generalizing that the game was primarily designed for a younger, less experienced audience. Yes, the game is designed in a way that's easy to get into, so that anyone can get started quickly, including little children. But people fixating on that element and generalizing the game as shallow, or not deep, was very frustrating. To combat this misconception, Sakurai created Smash Bros. Dojo, a part of the Smash Bros. Website that was dedicated to explaining the gameplay mechanics and character moves. Sakurai gave up his weekends for 2 months in order to make these updates, as he wanted to ensure that the public would have a clear understanding of the game. I'm glad I did it. I think it was a good thing. I wouldn't have gotten an understanding of what people really thought of the game at work, surrounded by other developers, but I made a poll on the website and opened it up to viewers to send in their responses, so I got to read the opinions of a lot of different people, and that was really encouraging. Smash Bros. Was developed around one of Sakurai's key design philosophies: easy to play, hard to master. The point is, it's gentle to beginners, but if you dig further, it's actually a very deep game. As a fighting game, it completely breaks away from genre conventions. In many ways, it creates its own style of fighter altogether. Looking at typical fighting games, you can see the screen is fairly static. Characters can jump, crouch, dash forward and backwards, but generally movement is fairly restricted. When you look at Smash, you can immediately see how different it is from traditional fighters. You see characters moving all over the screen, jumping up high, getting knocked out of bounds, grabbing the edge of the stage. Smash birthed a new type of fighting game altogether, a platform fighter. There had been a game with a similar concept before, an arcade exclusive called Outfoxies, but Smash was the first to really develop the idea into a solid game that would stand the test of time. One of the key concepts of a platform fighter is it has a much greater freedom of movement. Instead of just taking place on flat levels, as in most traditional fighters, the stages of Smash Bros. Have a lot more variations, with different platform configurations and stage hazards that players would have to navigate during their fight. Another thing that Smash Bros. Does differently is health. Instead of trying to fully deplete your enemy's health bar, the aim is instead to knock your opponent off the screen. When you attack your opponents, you cause damage to them, which is shown in percentage. The higher the percentage, the further your attacks will send your opponent flying. This gives players a chance to recover more often, and makes matches more freeform by not having a definitive limit on how much damage a player can take. This gameplay mechanic of knocking characters off the screen is said to be inspired by a Japanese children's game, Ohajiki, which is similar to the Western game Marbles, but instead it's played with coin-shaped pieces, which are thrown at each other in order to knock them out of a ring. You can see the developers paying tribute to the concept's origins in the Street Pass Battle mode, found in Smash Bros. For 3DS. In Smash, you hit your opponent to increase their damage percentage, but I thought it would be boring if your opponent just collapsed and fell on the ground once you hit a certain percentage. So I came up with the idea of the higher your opponent's damage, the further they fly, which is where I thought I could really add some depth and increase the breadth of the game. You can see this added depth in the way players can create various strategies in order to maximize damage and KO opponents quickly by using techniques like the Meteor Smash. By using a down air attack on an opponent who is off the stage, you can KO them at a low damage by limiting their recovery or knocking them clean off the screen. The controls are incredibly simple when compared to most fighting games. There's only 5 buttons in the game: jump, normal attack, special attack, block, and grab, and that's it. There aren't any complicated button combos or complicated stick movements you need to master. This system is incredibly simple. There are only 2 attack buttons, and if you combine the buttons with a different direction, you'll be able to perform different attacks. And whilst you're in the air, there are more normal attacks available to you. This allows the player to build their own combos and playstyle, rather than having to memorize each character's button inputs and long combos. You already know the basics for each character as soon as you pick them up. You just need to learn how to utilize their moves to the greatest effect. A, normal attack, up A, up tilt can be used to juggle opponents in the air, down A, down tilt, and side A, strong attack. And if up A, down A, and side A are timed correctly, you can perform a smash attack, a more powerful attack that will send opponents flying. B is neutral special, usually a projectile or a strong attack. Up plus B is up special, which is usually an up thrust attack which can be used for recovery. Down B, down special, another special attack, usually a tactical option, such as Fox's Reflect or Samus's Bombs. Z Shield lets you block incoming attacks. Also, if you move left or right, your character will roll. This can be used to quickly dodge attacks if timed correctly. R will grab opponents and allow you to throw them either forwards or backwards. The developers put a lot of thought and consideration into all the characters' attacks, basing their moves off of abilities that the characters had in their own games. Mario has his iconic fireballs and super jump. Link has his boomerang, bombs, and spin attack. Pikachu has Thunder Jolt and Quick Attack. Samus has her Charge Beam, Screw Attack, and Bombs. Kirby even has his Copy ability, which allows him to copy the neutral special of any of the in-game playable characters. In the case of Fox and Captain Falcon, they've been given an entirely unique moveset, as in Star Fox and F-Zero, they pilot vehicles, but even then special care was taken to make sure the attacks fit their character, such as Fox having his moves being laser-based, and Captain Falcon being based around speed. Another mechanic that makes Smash Bros. Unique is the items. Throughout matches, random items will drop onto the stage. These add a random element that can change the tide of battle. There are a few original items created for the game, but the majority of them are from Nintendo games, such as Pokeballs from Pokemon, Koopa Shells, Fire Flower and Star from Mario, and more. As to be expected, the fighting game mainstay. Here you pick a character and play through a number of stages broken up with bonus stages, break the targets, board the platforms, and race to the finish. The stages are the same for each character, where they fight characters from the main roster, up to boss characters such as Metal Mario, Fighting Polygon Team, and finally Master Hand. The basic premise for the story is never fully explained, however it's implied that Master Hand is the one that brought these characters to life, animating these toys to make them fight. At the end, you're rewarded with an ending screen unique to each character, and if you fulfill certain conditions, you have the opportunity to unlock secret characters. The arcade mode is the main meat of the game, as it serves as a place to learn and hone your skills. However, the bonus stages, break the targets and board the platforms, are really where the game teaches you its intricacies. Each stage is built specifically for the character, and the way the obstacles are laid out will force you to use each fighter's moveset in different ways. The game starts with a roster of 8 characters and 4 more you can unlock. You have Mario, Donkey Kong, Link, Samus, Yoshi, Kirby, Fox, and Pikachu. And later, you'll be able to unlock Jigglypuff, Captain Falcon, Luigi, and Ness. As the single player was a good place to hone your skills, multiplayer was the place to test them. For multiplayer, there's 2 options of how to play. Timed mode, where each player must fight to earn points by knocking off other players to a set time limit. No one really plays this, unless they forget to change it to stock mode, where you're given a set number of lives and the last player standing wins. Both modes can also be played in free-for-all or team battle with up to 4 players at a time, and you can choose to have an AI fight and select the difficulty. At this time, seeing 4 players fighting on screen simultaneously had not been seen before, as most fighting games traditionally were a 1v1 affair. There are 8 maps that players can fight across, and 1 more that's unlockable. For the time, this was a standard amount of content for a fighting game. However, it was clear a lot of care had gone into Super Smash Bros. There was so much attention to detail for all of the franchise involved. All of the characters had been faithfully recreated, along with their stages and items, with all of their moves being inspired by their abilities in their respective game franchises. You can see that the team really cared about creating something special, even with a modest budget and limited time. But now it was time to see if the public would be interested. Back when the game came out, I didn't think it would get much support, though during development, of course, I had a lot of faith. I really thought that this would be good, but the reviews that came out right before release weren't as good as I thought they would be, so there was a time I felt pretty bad about that. The game was released in Japan on the 21st of January 1999. The game was met with stronger sales than expected, selling 1.97 million units. And this was enough to convince Nintendo that Smash deserved an international release. On the 26th of April 1999, Smash Bros. Was released in the US, and expectations were surpassed, with Smash selling 2.93 million units, and then a further 650,000 in Europe, selling a total 5.55 million units. This made Smash Bros. The 5th best-selling game on the N64. Super Smash Bros. Built a strong and dedicated fanbase, playing the game and supporting it for months after it was released. In an interview on the HAL Laboratories website, Sakurai was surprised in the continued interest in the game. It really makes me happy that people still want to cover that game now in September, even though it was released in January. From a PR perspective, is this level of coverage normal? Super Smash Bros. Was a success, with players sinking hours and hours into its accessible yet deep combat. Sakurai and his team at HAL Laboratories had outdone themselves, smashing the expectations that Nintendo had set out for them. Now Smash Bros. Was standing toe-to-toe with the biggest first-party releases from Nintendo, and expectations were building. With Nintendo's backing and new unfamiliar hardware, would the team be able to outdo themselves again? Sakurai wanted to find out. Thank you for watching. This has been the first part of a Super Smash Bros. Documentary I've been planning for a while. The second part is going to focus on Super Smash Bros. Melee and the rise of the competitive scene in Smash. If you liked this video and you'd like to see more, then please help to support the channel by subscribing, liking, and if you know anyone that might enjoy this video, please share it with them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.